Good afternoon. My name is Brenda Tyndall. I am the Executive Director of the Harvard Museums of Science and Culture, where our mission is to foster curiosity and a spirit of discovery in visitors of all ages, enhancing public understanding of and an appreciation for the natural world, science, and human cultures. This mission in mind, I am delighted to welcome you to tonight's lecture on the literacy and education of ancient Egyptian artists, sponsored by the Harvard Museum of the Ancient Near East. We are delighted to have Dr. Dimitri Labouri with us tonight, who will discuss the levels of literacy and scholarly education among the makers of the countless hieroglyphic monuments and help make ancient Egypt so famous. You can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit questions anytime during the program, and our speaker will address as many as time allows at the end of the presentation. It is now my pleasure to introduce Peter Dermawelian, Barbara Bell Professor of Egyptology at Harvard University and Director of the Harvard Museum of the Ancient Near East. He will introduce tonight's speaker. Thank you and enjoy the program.
Thanks so much, Brenda. Welcome to all of you. Delighted to have so many of you with us. This is a very special year in Egyptology. As many of you may know, it's the centenary of the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb and 200 years since the decipherment of hieroglyphs. So we're excited to see where Egyptology can take us this year. This is the first of our 3 lectures for the semester. The other 2, if you have your pens and pencils out, the other 2 will be March 31st and April 21. March 31st and April 21. But tonight you're in for a special treat. I'm glad you could join us. Dimitri Labouri is Research Director of the Belgian National Fund for Scientific Research, or FNRS, and Associate Professor at the University of Liège, where he just returned about 2 days ago from working in Egypt, and he's already jumped into teaching again. He teaches ancient Egyptian art history, archaeology, history, and history of religion. Trained as an art historian and an Egyptologist, not always the same thing, he's participated in several archaeological expeditions in Egypt, notably in the Theban area, that's modern-day Luxor. And he currently co-directs the Belgian archaeological mission in the Theban necropolis. Thanks to a research incentive grant from the Belgian FNRS, he's been directing an important project in recent years on painters and painterly practices in the Theban necropolis during the 18th dynasty, studying ancient Egyptian artists, their practices, and their social status in pharaonic Egypt. His bibliography includes these monographs, along with many, many articles: La statuaire de Thutmose III, essai d'interprétation d'un portrait royal dans son contexte historique, or an interpretive essay of a royal portrait in its historical context, 1998, an archaeological biography of Akhenaten, or should I say Akhenaton, if we're doing French, in 1998, and the Oxford Handbook of Egyptian Epigraphy and Paleography that he co-edited with Vanessa Davies. That last book being especially dear to my heart as a fan and practitioner of digital epigraphy. Tonight, we're very lucky to get his keen insights on his lecture topic on the literacy and education of ancient Egyptian artists. Dimitri, the virtual podium is all yours.
Thank you very much, Peter. It's very kind of you, very kind introduction. I'm delighted to be here with you this evening, or tonight for me, to present my research on literacy and education among ancient Egyptian artists at the Harvard Museum of the Ancient Near East. So let me share the screen. Here we go, I think. So one of the salient characteristics of ancient Egypt undoubtedly is its hieroglyphic script. The code to decipher this writing system was cracked precisely 200 years ago, as Peter just reminded us, in 1822 by the brilliant French linguist Jean-François Champollion, the founding father of Egyptology. Champollion by this discovery allowed us the access to ancient Egyptian sources. It allowed to reconstruct the history of ancient Egyptian civilization through coeval and native sources, and not only through the sources derived from Greek and Latin literature. And so reading the hieroglyphs defines nowadays Egyptology. It's the founding act of our discipline, but reading hieroglyphs also defines Egyptologists, and maybe we are a little bit twisted by this fact. Ancient Egyptian civilization was characterized by a rather complex writing system, as you all know, with hundreds of signs and moreover different kinds of scripts. Let's take together an example. Let's say it's the sign of the man sitting on the floor. So I have to invert it because in ancient Egyptian, you write from right to left and not to left to right. Only for monumental reason, you can invert the orientation of hieroglyphs. This system, as I said, this writing system was composed by hundreds of signs and different kinds of scripts, mainly monumental hieroglyphs that you all know, and tachygraphies like hieratic and later on demotic. This situation induced a quite restricted level of literacy within Pharaonic population. The subject elicited many studies and speculation, but if the percentage of literate people in ancient Egypt has been variably estimated, there is a clear consensus on the conclusion that scribal skills constituted the privilege of a very small proportion of the population. So we have to make a distinction, a clear distinction here between hieroglyphs, including some linear hieroglyphs, proper hieroglyphs, and the tachygraphies. The researchers on literacy in ancient Egypt have almost exclusively focused on the practice of hieratic, the everyday life script for most of ancient Egyptian history, as well as on scribes as a professional category, so the right-hand side of my screen. Regarding the mastery of hieroglyphs, few signatures of monumental inscriptions converge to suggest that it was a specialty of its own, an even more restricted knowledge designated as the secrets of hieroglyphs, literally the divine words in ancient Egyptian. And this specialty was practically monopolized by two categories of highly educated priests, namely the so-called lector or ritual priest and the scribe of divine writings, who were in the majority of recorded cases responsible for the hieroglyphic ordination or edition of those texts. We have to keep in mind also that nowadays Egyptologists are trained from hieroglyphs to hieratic. So we first study hieroglyphs and then hieratic, its derivation in tachygraphy, in speedy writing. But it was not the same in ancient times. So this induced a quite restricted level of literacy, as I just said. In ancient times, we have some pedagogic evidence that shows that, of course, ancient scribes studied first hieratic and then maybe hieroglyphic writing. We have here a pedagogic board, a drawing board that was found by my colleague José Manuel Galán, published in the Journal of Egyptian Archaeology of 2007. And on the right-hand side, next to the design of a statue on the left, I will go back to this later on in my lecture, you have the beginning of a famous text that was copied as a training for learning hieratic script. And as you can see, this is hieratic and not hieroglyphic. So this is the way ancient scribes used to be trained in reading and writing ancient Egyptian language. In this context, it seems particularly relevant to consider the issue of literacy in terms of knowledge as well as of practices among the trades involved in artistic production, in charge of the making and decoration of the monuments destined to bear so many hieroglyphic inscriptions. What did they know about hieroglyphic writing, those artists? So my second point will be, and it will be the longest one, about ancient Egyptian artists' relation to written culture. I must stress first that there is a text well known in Egyptology, the so-called Satire of Trades, that was supposed to provide us with an emic point of view, that is an ancient Egyptian point of view, on the issue of artists and their relation to written culture. But this text that aims at reviling any other function than the one of scribes was a product made by scribes themselves. So it's a cultural discourse created by scribes, and by definition, since it was meant to be read, intended for their own community. In this text, so the text starts with the idea that artists were not at the same level as scribes because they were not sent on a mission and their work was very painful. But Egyptological evidence proves to be in flagrant contradiction with the argument presented to disparage the social status of artists in this text. And to the contrary, they rather suggest a close sociological proximity and many factors of parallelism from an emic point of view between art practitioners and scribes, a more than plausible motive for the latter to wish to distance themselves from the former. So this is a scribal discourse and we cannot rely on it. If you want some more information, I dealt with this topic in a contribution to the studies in honor of Pascal Vermus. Second, it's very important to address the issue of zesh, which is the verb used in ancient Egyptian language to refer to writing. But obviously, if you open the dictionary of ancient Egyptian language, the Wörterbuch der ägyptischen Sprache, it's plain to see that this verb does not only mean writing, it also refers to painting and other correlated notions. Let's take an example here from the cemetery of El Awawish of the 6th dynasty, so the age of the Old Kingdom, where 2 tombs were signed by a couple of 2 brothers who were in charge of the designing and decoration of those 2 tombs. In the 2 tombs, you have a reference to the painter Zeshked in Egyptian, Seni in blue, and his brother Izezi, who was a scholar of his time, a scholar priest in charge of hieroglyphic writing. So his full title is Scribe of the Houses, the Divine Writings of the Palace, who's next to his brother, the painter Seni. In the first tomb, in chronological order, and the one on the left of the screen, Seni claimed that he has zeshed, or written the tomb in which he is depicted. In the next tomb, made just after the first one, Seni added a panel of inscription where he stressed that he's the one who has zeshed the tomb next door, that is the tomb of Kheni on the left-hand side of the slide, and also the one of Chechi Iker on the right-hand side of the screen, being alone. This example is very interesting because it shows that zesh can mean write or paint, decorate, but also designing of the decoration, because it's clear that Izezi was the designer as the scholar of the couple of brothers. He was the designer of the decoration scheme of the 2 tombs, and Seni was the maker with his hands, if I may say so, as the painter. But both could claim the action of zesh of the 2 tombs. So the idea of zesh, of writing, is much more expanded than in modern English. It means writing, painting, and also conceiving or designing the decoration of an ancient monument. So we can rely on textual evidence to assess the ancient Egyptian artist's relation to written culture. Since 1959, Hermann Juncker has drawn attention of Egyptologists to the fact that in the Old Kingdom, many artists bore some titles that present themselves as highly educated scholars, like Cherieb or lector priest or scribe of the divine writings, as I said earlier in my talk. Here is an example with Pepi and Ihi Emsa Pepi, a painter of the residence who went to Meir to decorate the tomb of Pepi Ankh Henikem. And is always systematically presented as ritual priest, so as a priest of the highest rank, a scholar priest of his time. And we have evidence of that kind from every single period of ancient Egyptian history. Let's move to an example known in Boston for the Metropolitan, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston owns some object from this tomb, the tomb of Jehutihotep in Bersha, of the 12th dynasty. It was decorated by a painter who prominently showed himself in his own composition here. You can see here. This painter's name is Jorge Anjou. His title has vanished nowadays, but previous recordings clearly shows that he was also lector priest and painter. So a top artist who was a scholar artist. And there are many other evidences of this kind, like here in the tomb of Jepai Hapi in Asyut. Another, so it was the hugest tomb of ancient Egypt at that time. And it was also signed by the painter who decorated this tomb, and he presented himself also as a lector priest. In other periods, we also have self-portraits in assistenza, as art history calls them. So it's depictions of painters who introduced themselves in their own work, like here in Hierakonpolis or El Kab, or also in the lower part of the slide in the El Medina of the 19th dynasty or the Ramesside period, with self-portraits. So in assistenza, so when the painter depicted himself in the role of a priest or a scholar, and those shows that the artists who had access to monumental or written desks depicted themselves as highly educated or literate scholars. This is very well established. We also have this famous stela of the artist Ichtisen, now kept in the Louvre Museum. It was exhibited during the Middle Kingdom exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York, a few years ago. And in this stela, the artist explicitly said that he knows he was introduced in the secrets of the hieroglyph. This is the first competence he wanted to show off. And then through the structure of the stela, introduced by a specific sentence in ancient Egyptian, which means it's a fact that I know. He introduced the 4 criteria that were used from an emic or ancient Egyptian point of view to assess the good quality of an artist. First, the sacred and scholarly knowledge, including the knowledge of hieroglyphs, then proportions mastery, third, iconographic expertise, and fourth, technical competencies. So we have clear textual evidence to assess this issue. Another example here, the chief sculptor Hatiai in post-Amarna times, which reveals in his own autobiographical stela that he was initiated Bessi in ancient Egyptian. That means that he had access to an even more restricted sacred knowledge about the secrets of the universe exclusively accessible to Pharaoh and his surrogates, his viziers, the highest categories of priests, but also at least some master artists. In addition to such explicit claims as literati or scholars, ancient Egyptian artists also displayed many indirect, more subtle or implicit signs of their scribal abilities through their practicalities. First of all, of course, they could write because they wrote some visitors' inscriptions, like here in the tomb of Keruef of the 18th dynasty that was visited in the following centuries in the Ramesside period by some scribes and also some painters who wrote their name here, a painter of the domain of Amun who went to visit this monument. Ancient Egyptian artists also went out to visit very old monuments, like in the New Kingdom, they visited monuments of the age of the Old Kingdom, of the Pyramid Age, like here in the funerary complex of Pepi II in Saqqara, where Gustave Jecquier found some inscriptions of visitors, like here, this one of a Hemu, which means an artist, Imenem Heb, a name specific of the New Kingdom, as the paleography of the inscription shows. So those artists could visit ancient monuments and they could sign, which means that they could write, of course. In some cases, they also left some inscriptions, very literary ones. Like here in tomb 139 in the Theban necropolis, the tomb of Bahiri, where was fixed a very famous inscription that was published by Sir Allard Gardiner, a very important Egyptologist of the first part of the previous century, who helped Howard Carter in the study of the tomb of Tutankhamun. This graffito is very well known for its historical and religious content, but it's often forgotten that it was written again by a painter whose name was Bargai, who wrote this inscription, and this inscription is full of literary references. For example, there are some references to Old Kingdom literature, so 1,000 years before. It's as if in an English graffito, you would quote Shakespeare. In this case, it's the same that Bargai tried to do in this very literary inscription. So they could make very important literary references in their writing, which means that they had a high level of education and of literacy, of course. There are also some pedagogical evidence, as I suggested earlier, that seems to indicate that artistic training was practiced along with scribal training, at least for some artists, for the best of them. So we are back to this drawing board, which is some sort of an iPad of its time. On the left-hand side, you have a sketch for the designing of statues, as José Manuel Galán was able to show. And on the other, the right-hand side of this so-called ancient iPad, you have some training of hieratic writing that was made probably by the same person. And anytime you have drawing boards of this kind, with drawings, they are always connected with hieratic scribal exercises, suggesting that artistic training was practiced alongside scribal training, at least for best artists. Some artists also showed themselves with very important responsibilities in terms of literacy or tomb production, like this Bahiri of El Kab, who was a painter of Amun, who was in charge, as the inscription explicitly says here, in charge of the making of the tomb of his grandfather, the veteran Ahmose, son of Ibana. But at that time, inscriptions in the tomb also show that he was already confident of the treasurer and scribe accountant of grains in the southern district. So this means that next to being a painter in the domain of Amun, he was also involved in the accounting administration of his time as a scribe. And he eventually became the governor of his own town, El Kab and Esna, as is shown in his tomb made just next door, in which he was able to show that his reed, which means his pen or brush, made him famous. So we have clear evidence here that we are dealing with a painter who was highly literate and a scholar painter. There are other examples of that kind of thing. So, for example, in the Theban tomb 32 of the time of Ramses II, in the name of Jehuti Mose, the control notes in the quarrying of the sloping passage of the tomb were noted by a painter, or here written outline draftsman in the name of Pai, who wrote those inscriptions. So he was able of controlling the work of the making of this tomb, but also to note it down on the wall. So again, he was a literate person. On the walls of the Theban tombs themselves, sometimes there are some hieratic indications, like here in this small scene in the tomb of Chanuro. Just on top of this figure, you have a small indication in hieratic, Za'ef Jehuti, which means his son Jehuti, probably an indication of the label to be depicted or painted on top of this person, so to name this person. And we can expect that the painter did not know by name all the members of the family of his commissioning patron. Another clear case, or clearer case, in TT Theban tomb 90, the tomb of Nebamun, where we can see here another inscription next to a young lady, his daughter Yu-Yi, and on top of it, as you can see on the left-hand side, he wrote in proper hieroglyph his beloved daughter, Yue. So this indication was probably to note the name of the figure to be labeled in the following step in the making of those paintings. So the painter who wrote this was able to write in hieratic again. And this was very important, as I just said, to know the name of all the members of the family to be depicted in the tomb of your commissioning patron. But obviously it was not always easy to remember or to know all of them. We have a clear case here with a scene in the tomb of Chenuna, where the painter adapted his text to refer to the father and mother of the tomb owner, but he didn't know their name, so he left the column blank, waiting for the information to be written in those columns. So this shows that it was an issue to know, to have these information at hand, and in some cases they could write them in hieratic to be quicker. A very interesting case was identified by Eike Guksch or Heyer in her excavation of Theban tomb 79, the tomb of Menkaure Raseneb, where she could find the sketch on an ostracon, so on a sherd of ceramic, the sketch for the inscription of a specific scene in which the tomb owner wanted to refer to his ancestors. So it's a very special case. And by chance, we have the copy medium and the final copy. If we look at the ostracon and compare it to the actual, the physical transposition of the inscription on the wall, as you can see here, I put some photographic addition where the scribe or the painter changed the orthography of the words. And also the red lines indicate the separation of the columns on the walls. This shows you that the painter re-edited the text that he had at hand on this ostracon on the wall to adapt it to the shape of the wall, the shape of the scene. So he was able to re-edit the text to change the orthography, to cut the text into columns according to the end of the words and not in the middle of the word, which is not very well expected or in hieroglyphic writing inscription. So this shows that, again, this painter was able to read such a draft and to transpose it and edit it on the walls. A very nice case was found in our concession in the Belgian archaeological mission in the Theban necropolis, in the tomb, Theban tomb TT29, the tomb of the vizier Amenemope. Amenemope, who was vizier in the 18th dynasty in the time of Amenhotep II, was the successor of Rekhmira, a very famous vizier in the time of Thutmose III, so his predecessor, who had one of the hugest tombs in ancient Egyptian times. So he wanted to emulate his predecessor and ask his painter to copy some scenes in the tomb of Rekhmira. So you have the scene in the tomb of Rekhmira on the upper side of the slide, and in the lower part, the tomb of Amenemope. You can see that the scene where the vizier received the petitioners in his office was copied from one tomb to the other. And Amenemope also asked his painter to accompany this scene with a famous text in Egyptological literature, the so-called Duties of the Vizier, a text that refers to the duties of the holder of the vizierate. The problem is that in the tomb of Amenemope, he miscalculated the space that he had at hand on the wall, and he had a too narrow space to squash this wall in between two scenes. We were very lucky in our excavations because we found the rubbish bin of this painter, and we found some ostraca that he used to copy the text from the tomb of Rekhmira and edit it to transpose it in the tomb of Amenemope. With this, we have the end of the Duties of the Vizier. So it was a scoop in Egyptology. It was published by Pierre Tallet. And what is really interesting for me is this second ostracon. So the ostracon was prepared with some lines to have like a notebook. And then he wrote the text, and next to the text, he wrote in red, Gez 14. Gez means the side. in ancient Egyptian. It's a sign, it's a hieroglyphic sign to refer to the side of something, and then 14. It was rather mysterious for us, this indication, until we discovered that the section of the text that was copied was actually the equivalent of what you find in column 13 and 14 in the tomb of Amenemope. This proves that the painter divided his text because he had to re-edit it. He divided it into sections so he could manipulate those sections in order to start with the first square of the space he had to fill with the text and to finish with the last square. And if he did not make this work of editing of his text, he would fail for sure to end at the last square of the panel of inscription. So this shows that there was a need to edit the text, and of course, to edit such a text, you need to be an Egyptologist or an ancient Egyptian who could read and write hieroglyphs. And once again, this text is not written in hieratic, it's written in linear hieroglyphs. More interestingly, even, we found another ostracon, again the same size of a modern iPad, on which the painter copied the text of the caption of the label of the vizier in his office, as you can see on the upper left-hand side part of the slide, and the ostracon is on the right-hand side. So this is the part he copied on the text, and this part was copied, or at least for its first half, in the tomb of Amenemope. Again, this ostracon was found in the rubbish bin of our painter. The comparison of the original, the copy medium, and the final version allows to track for the 7 errors, to play the game of the 7 errors. And we can see, for example, that he scrupulously copied the text from the scene in the tomb of Rekhmira, at least for the first half of the text, with some emendations that were contaminated by hieratic writing. So the grouping of some signs, as the ones you have here or there, is contaminated by the habits of the tachygraphy of hieratic, so the tachygraphic writing, and was not faithfully copying the original that you have on the wall of the tomb of Rekhmira. And what is really interesting is that at the end of the inscription, when you reach the name of the vizier that he would have to change, he wrote in ancient Egyptian, the vizier somebody, son of Mr. Somebody, born of Mrs. Somebody, because he knew that he had to change the name of the guys. So he did not copy the name. He wrote like X or Y in the name of those person, men for a man in ancient Egyptian, or menet for a woman in ancient Egyptian language. This type of editing ostraka is actually quite well attested. It fits very well with what Barbara Lüscher published about the decoration of the burial chamber in Theban tomb 79, the tomb of Nachtmin, where he wanted, the tomb owner wanted to have a copy of some extract of the Book of the Dead. And Barbara Lüscher found and published the ostraka that he used. Some of them are numbered, some of them are localized in the tomb with some indications whether the text should go to the southern part or the northern part of the tomb. And what is interesting is that the procedure to transform this flake of stone into a notebook is exactly the same. And it seems to correspond to a normal procedure. So to copy text by painters, those who made hieroglyphs, it seems that there was a procedure. And of course, those people were highly literate to adapt those texts, to edit the text according to the space available on the walls. The final example I'd like to show in this respect is also the tomb, Theban tomb 161 of a certain Nacht. This man was not meant to have a tomb. He was a gardener of Amun. He was in charge of the floral bouquet to offer to the god. It's very interesting to see that in this tomb, the painter involved himself a lot in his work, indicating or suggesting that there might have been some personal connection between the patron and his artist. And for example, you never encounter such exuberant floral bouquets in ancient Egyptian art throughout the entire ancient Egyptian art history, only in this tomb, probably because the painter wanted to stress this aspect of the work of his patron, probably, it's my guess at least, a friend of his. What is very interesting for our topic of this evening is that the title of our Nacht, offering bearer of Amun, was encoded in new hieroglyphs. I mean, hieroglyphs that were invented by the painter. So you can see it here with a detail. So to refer to the verb fai, to bear, and then offering floral offerings, he wrote the sign of the viper, which is a phonetic reminder of fai, to bear. And then he used a ready-made hieroglyph, the hieroglyph of the man rising up or lifting up his arms. He put on top of them an offering table for hetep, for offerings, and then on top of them, floral bouquets. So he invented, before Ptolemaic time, he invented a new hieroglyph specifically for his tomb owner. So he could adapt on the specificities of his tomb owner's requests. And what is really interesting is that in two other occasions in this tomb, he invented variations of these new hieroglyphs with modification of this concept. So he was really a master in hieroglyphic writing so that he could invent new hieroglyphs. And of course, this guy was a painter, as you can see from the painting of the inscription. So this leads to really the Renaissance concept of the Homo Universalis, or what Leon Battista Alberti, the author of a famous treatise De Pictura about painting, called the Doctus Pictor. So the idea of a painter who was a scholar painter, we could translate in English, which was a founding concept in Renaissance art. I quote here two examples from the Low Countries, in the Netherlands on the left-hand side, or in Liège, my hometown, on the right-hand side, of writers whose aim was to show that the painters they were referring to were actually Doctus Pictor, or in Latin, Docti Pictores in plural. And it's clear that top master artists of ancient Egypt, those who pop up in monumental landscape, those who had access to monumental and written desks, were, of course, each one of them was a Doctus Pictor. It's the case of Ihi-Emsapepi, of Irtisen, of Orimenianku, or Hatiai that we commented earlier. And also, we have to stress that Deir el-Medina, the village where were housed, was settled, the community of artists and artisans who were in charge of the making of the tombs in the Valley of the Kings, was full, at least in the Ramesside period, of Docti Pictores, or Doctus Pictor in singular, like this one that I show, the scholar painter Amenhotep, son of Amun-Nakhte. He was a star of his time. He was commissioned to work in many places for the king as well as for private patrons. And he was the son of another painter who became a scribe, the scribe of the community, and even a writer, Amennacht, son of Ipui, his father, who wrote the famous Wisdom of Amennacht, so who was really a literate writer. But next to those guys who were top artists, those who pop up in the documentation, we have also to acknowledge the existence of poorly literate artists or art practitioners, actors of the artistic production. This is the case, for example, in the 18th dynasty in the same community of Deir el-Medina, if we take into account the Theban tomb 340 of a certain Amenemhat made by his son Senefer. This is a very, very tiny burial chamber. So most of the tombs of this period are undecorated, but this one is decorated. And as you can see from the dimensions, I could not stand in it. It's very, very small. When you look at the decoration, it's plainly obvious that it's directly derived from the iconographical concept used on entry-level funerary monuments, namely stela. So you have on top of the composition the double wadjet eye with the incense spot and the triple line for the water, like you have on stelae. And also for the lower register, you have the offering in front of the sitting couple of the deceased, or the adoration of the gods of the afterlife, Osiris and or Anubis. In this tomb, there is a specific panel where the writer of or the maker of this decoration, including the writing of the inscriptions, signed his own work. It was studied by late Jean-Marie Cruchten in the publication of this tomb by Nadine Cherpion in the MIFAO in 1999. And Jean-Marie Cruchten was able to show that the inscriptions are full of mistakes. So in this inscription, the writer wanted to note that it's me, so it's written here in French, it's me, the son who writes correctly and make his name live again. But by writing that he is the one who writes correctly, he made a lot of mistakes. And Jean-Marie Cruchten was able to show that he does not know the principle of hieroglyphic writing, but only monoconsonantal signs. That is the alphabetic signs of hieroglyphic writing, the basic of hieroglyphic writing, and very standard basic funerary formulae learned by rote. So clearly he never went to scribal school, but he reused some very frequent funerary formula that he tried to amend with monoconsonantal signs. And by doing so, he made a lot of mistakes, betraying his actual level of literacy. And he showed that he could not write properly. Also, some signs are badly shaped, like this one, for example. So he tried to correct learn by rote formula according to the phonetical evolution of Egyptian language of his time. So he corrected with monoconsonantal signs some spelling that are usual spelling according to the phonological evolution of Egyptian language of his time. So it's really brilliant, as I often say when I refer to this case. So when I presented this case to my student the first time, they told me he's really stupid, this guy, he could not write. And I told them, no, you're completely wrong. He was a genius because he learned to write and read hieroglyph by himself, because he knew some hieroglyphs from his visual culture and tried to read on his own, like actually Jean-François Champollion did when he was a small kid. It's also interesting to see how he designed his panels of writings, like here. So normally hieroglyphs are supposed to be aligned to according to the figures to which they are related. So here the figures are looking outward, but the text is oriented inward, which is an abnormality in hieroglyphic writing. Furthermore, you have some signs that are excluded from the panel, like here or there. This is not normal in hieroglyphic panel, and the writing of the same formula diverge from one side to another. That kind of mistakes is absolutely abnormal for a normal scribe in ancient Egypt. And it's interesting to note that they are also attested in the official business of the people of the 18th dynasty community of the Medina, like here in the tomb of Amenhotep II, KV 35, where the division of the title of Anubis, Anubis Tebjuef, in front of his hill, the word hill is divided by the line of the column, which is absolutely abnormal for a proper scribe. So this shows that those inscriptions, like the decoration, which is also a little bit awkward, was made by people who went out of their comfort zone. And this is the case for all the 18th dynasty tombs of the Medina, which shows real oddities in the decoration of those monuments. So there's a clear contrast between this painter, who was a professional painter, he knows how to handle a brush, he knows how to prepare paintings, but he doesn't know how to write in proper hieroglyph. He tried to venture in this direction, but he clearly went out of his comfort zone and made many mistakes that betrayed his real level of literacy. And there's a clear contrast between him, Abu Sennefer on the right-hand side, and the scholar painter of the 20th dynasty of the Al-Medina, Amenhotep, son of Amun-Nakhte, that we've seen earlier. There's also a clear contrast with the painters usually in charge of the decoration of the private tomb in the Theban necropolis, probably because there were different modalities of work, but I won't go too much into details in this respect in this lecture tonight. We have a lot of indirect evidence of the existence of those anonymous actors in royal artistic productions. For example, in post-Amarna restoration. In post-Amarna restoration, so the references to the god Amun were hacked out in the time of Akhenaten, and then they needed to be restored in post-Amarna art. And we have a lot of indications, like here in the small Thutmose temple at Medinet Habu, small indications of the text to be restored. So somebody came and has written in linear hieroglyph what was to be restored in the hacked out inscriptions relating to the god Amun. What is really interesting is that these modalities, these instructions do not only pertain to text, but also to images. Like here in the birth portico of the temple of Hatshepsut in Al-Bahari, you have a lot of those indications relating to text, but also to the iconography of the scene. Like here, you can plainly see that this scene is referring to this scene that needed to be redecorated or renewed. Again, another example here, and you have a small inscription, De Pinti, referring to what needed to be restored in the decoration, the initial decoration that was hacked out by the zealoters of Amenhotep IV Akhenaten. The most interesting example of those is probably this one from the so-called Cave of Hathor, which is now in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, Midan el-Tahrir, where you have two of those De Pinti. The first one is referring to the inscription, and you can see that this inscription is particular because the name of Amun-Ra was divided by the column here, and because of the setting, because of the place to be filled in with the inscription, so someone wrote Imen Ra Nebnezutawi Nepet, and this division of the name of the god with a line here is very specific. It's due to the fact that you have a larger column here because of the feathers of the god. Next to it, you have a small dipinto, so a small sketch that refers to the scene here, the depiction of the god Amun. So we have to take into account that the painter who renewed this inscription and this decoration, he lived in Amarna times. He knew that in the time of Akhenaten, every mention of the god Amun was hacked out, that he was working in the temple of Amun, but he needed the information of his boss to know what to put here. With this contracted information, he knew how to make a fully fledged with all the feathers, all the details of a magnificent sitting Amun, but without this information, it seems that he did not dare or did not know what to replace here in this hacked zone. And if you ask undergraduate starting student in Egyptology, if he had this hacked zone in a pre-Amarna temple, he would immediately know that it's a sitting figure of Amun, but obviously this Egyptian artist didn't know. He knew how to make perfectly with all the details the depiction of a sitting Amun, but he needed to have this trigger in the form of a sketch. So we have artists or actors in the artistic production capable of making a perfectly achieved pictures out of a very compressed and minimal iconographic or epigraphic information, but lacking what I would call an Egyptological knowledge necessary to conceive or restore an iconographical program with its religious implications. And this reminds us, of course, that those monuments were not only for aesthetical purposes, to be beautiful, to entertain visually, but also what was at stake was that they refer to the ritual and religious functioning of the world. So the world order was at stake in this case. And it was very important that you had a scholar painter giving the information to less gifted or educated professional artists nevertheless. And actually, they are, we can guess that this professional painter was probably of the same kind of this Senefa who decorated TT 340 that we've seen earlier. So this raises the issue of artistic autonomy, which is linked to the religious knowledge embedded or underlying the decoration of those monuments. And actually, there are many material traces or material evidence of this hierarchy in the royal artistic production with top artists who knew what to put where and professional practitioners who didn't know the underlying elements of religious aspect of this decoration, but who knew this segment in the business of artistic production. Let's just take here an example for the coloring. Here, a magnificent depiction of Moses III in the Luxor Museum. But if you look at the details, you can see that although it was perfectly well made, well designed and drawn, you can see that the painter made a lot of small mistakes. So he was probably a professional painter, but less gifted than the top artist. So there was clearly a hierarchy between top masters who were well attested in the monumental landscape and less educated painters or artists. This was also shown in the Barkroom, the study of the Barkroom in the Temple of City I, studied by John Baines, who showed that some elements, some difficult elements in the hieroglyphic decoration or for example, in the figurative decoration for the face of the king were left for the masters. There are very few, but there are some examples of that kind of things in private Theban tombs, like here in the tomb of Pazer, CT 367, where you have here this panel of text referring to the name and the titles of the tomb owner. And there are some weird signs, like here, the tomb owner was a child of the cap. So it's a small school that was made on purpose for the crown prince. And this cap sign is a very unusual sign. And clearly the painter didn't know about this sign. And so he derived it from a more usual sign that he switched at a right angle. The same is true for this sign, which is not so common. It's quite common, but not so common, the sign Chenet. And so he didn't know how to write it properly, and he derived its form from another sign just next to it in the panel. So we have misshaped signs due to a misunderstanding of the signs to be transcribed. And those mistakes are visual misunderstandings. They cannot derive from a hieratic original. They only derive from the shape of the hieroglyphs within the hieroglyphic corpus, which means that the painter who did this, he knew about the signs, he knew how to make the protome of a lion, an arm, or a mouse, but he didn't know, obviously, what was meant by those signs. He just knew them as images. Another example can be found in the famous tomb of Menna, TT 69, with this depiction of the god Osiris. In the name of Osiris is referred to as the Lord of Eternity, and the word eternity is written that way with two locks of hairs and the sign of the sun. But in this case, it's not the sign of the sun, it's the sign of an agricultural area, which has a shape compatible with the one of the sun. And clearly someone who can read would never make such a mistake. So it shows that This shows that our painter knew about the signs, knew how to make those signs, but he could not read hieroglyphic writing. Otherwise, he would not have made such a terrible mistake in the eyes of an Egyptologist. And actually, we have a lot of references to that kind of practices of using hieroglyphic thesaurus by artists for various purposes. Next to real inscriptions, sometimes noted in hieratic, we have many examples of the use of graphical encoding system parallel to the writing system proper. For example, in the roofing system of the burial chamber of the Great Pyramid, the name of Cheops is written in linear hieroglyph, as you can see here, or the same also in the control notes or the team marks in the pyramid of Mykerinus. What is really intriguing in this case is that it's written in linear hieroglyph and not in hieratic. You have here the sign of the quail in hieratic, and you can see that it was a proper quail drawn in hieroglyphic, so as an image. So this shows again that some practitioners in the art workforce, they were acquainted sufficiently with hieroglyph to use them as signs, as visual signs, but probably they could not read them properly or very, very well as fully literate person. We have also the same for very basic inscriptions, inquiry notes for the level. Here, the level is written in hieroglyphs and not in hieratic, but with rather weird hieroglyphs. And a very nice case was published by Miroslav Werner about the commanding axis of pyramids. So he discovered, it was published in the studies in honor of Jean-Philippe Loher, that in two pyramids, he found a system to draw the axe of the pyramids connected with three sides. So you have two abutting triangles on both sides, yes, that defines a line, which is the guiding line, the guiding axis for the pyramids, and next to it, you have three hieroglyphic signs. He was puzzled first because those three hieroglyphic signs in this sequence, wu, ju, wu, means nothing. And then he realized that in the dictionary of ancient Egyptian language, wuchu, this is the way you would read this phonetically, correspond to a word which means commanding or command. And so he deduced out of this that it was a way to write phonetically wuju, the commanding axis. And once again, those signs are not written in hieratic, they are written in proper or linear hieroglyphs. So it's reminiscent of what our painter Senefer did in Deir el-Medina. There are many cases of that kind of things for assemblages or orientation marks, like here on the roof slabs of the white chapels in Karnak, where those signs are semantically motivated. So the slabs on the right-hand side refer to the west. They have the sign for the west. Those on the east, they have the sign for the east. And those in the middle, they have the sign referring to the middle. But again, it's not hieratic, it's hieroglyphic. This is also well attested in the assemblages of the object in the tomb of Tutankhamun Peter was referring to earlier in the introduction of this talk, with semantically motivated signs like hindquarters signs here for the backside of some elements, but also with signs that have no semantic connection. It was just to align two elements because this sign means to give. There's no connection, of course, between those pieces and the idea of giving something. This has to be connected with the marking system with identity marks that was studied recently by Ben Haring, our colleague from the University of Leiden. And actually the site of Deir el-Medina provided us with a lot of those signs that were used to mark commodities, to mark identities. And it's connected with some hieroglyphic habits that are attested in architectural practices by ancient Egyptian practitioners of artistic production. Like here, you have some signs. They means nothing compared to the blocks or referring to the blocks. It's just reference. They use signs because they are ready-made signs. This use of signs derived from writing is actually quite well attested in cultural parallels, for example, in classical antiquity on the left-hand side, or in medieval times or late medieval times on the right-hand side. But of course, in ancient Egyptian civilization, it was influenced by the visuality of hieroglyphic script, which was made of proper images. in the context of permeability and symbiosis between images and script proper. I'd like here to refer to another nice example that was found in the excavations performed by, or the study performed by the archaeological mission, the Belgian archaeological mission in the Theban necropolis, in the tomb TT 96A, the tomb of Senefer. In the long hall, just in the middle of the long hall, a member of the team discovered, just in the middle, that if you zoom in, and again, we zoom in, you can see that there is a sign beneath the painting layers on top of the plaster on the walls. This sign can be really easily identified as a sitting man holding a cup to his mouth. And this scene is connected, of course, with this pictogram is connected with the scene of the banquet, which is just next to it. It's quite high up, 2.38 meters from the ground, but we know from the study of the tomb that the floor was recut for 70 centimeters. So we have to deduce this distance on the level. And if you take this into account, this shows that the pictogram was just at the right high level if you visit the tomb at the beginning of the making of this tomb. And of course, it was connected with some dividing marks and the scene just next to it, the scene of the banquet. So this means that the banquet scene was encoded with this sign. This sign is a pictogram. It's not written banquet scene in proper letters, if I may say so, in hieroglyphic writing. It's a pictogram, an image written by a hand who knows how to write hieratic. It's clear for an Egyptologist, but it was detectable or readable for someone who could not read hieroglyph or hieratic. It was just an image, a pictogram. We found another marking system just like this one in the broad hall of TT96, again, 96A, on this wall with the famous depiction of the Garden of Amun, which occupies 2/5 of this wall. So it's a very important scene for the tomb owner. And here again, so you have the distance, it's too high, but you have to take into account the lowering of the floor. You have this the sequence of signs of a tree and then a blossom. Again, it's linear hieroglyphs and not hieratic signs that were depicted here. You can see the hieratic signs on the right-hand side of the screen. Those signs are connected again with lines to divide the walls. So they were connected with the design, the composition of the depiction or the decoration of the wall. And what is really interesting is that it's written again in pictograms, because in the caption of the scene just next to it, we have the name of this garden, Ta'at and Het, the place of the trees. So the painter could have written this in proper letter, the place of the trees, and he preferred to write it with pictograms, with blossom and trees. So we have to imagine that the painter came when everything was plastered, the floor was higher. The painter came, divided the walls and noted, encoded the information of the scenes to be depicted here. And this is here with D-stretch treatment. You can see that there were probably 4 of those signs. So those pictograms encoded the information of the iconographic program, and this lift a corner of the curtains that veil the creativity of artists. This means that with those information, artists were able to decide how they will compose such a scene, whether they would decide to have 4, 3, 5 register of that kind of things. So who could read the hieroglyphs? We have some indications that shows that hieratic scribes could not always read hieroglyphs. For example, in the inscriptions left by visitors in the tomb of Khnumhotep in Beni Hassan, the tomb tree of Beni Hassan, our colleague Khaled Hassan, who published those inscriptions in the JARC, the Journal of American Research Center in Egypt of 2016, showed that some of them had the impression that they visited the tomb of or a monument of King Cheops, Khufu, because the name of the locality was Menat Khufu. So the name of Khufu was mentioned in the inscription. And because of this, they imagined that they visited the tomb or a monument, a hut of Khufu, although this is the tomb of somebody who lived centuries after and who was a member of the elite and not a member of the royal family. The same holds true for Titi or Theban tomb 60, a tomb that was intensely visited by Egyptologists, as you can see, but you have also to imagine that this Middle Kingdom tomb was visited by scribes and people interested in the past in the 18th dynasty or the New Kingdom. And next to a royal kiosk depiction, two inscriptions refer to the monuments of Neferu Sobek, who was a queen of the late Middle Kingdom. And in this kiosk, there was a depiction of King Senusret I. So this means that they understood close to nothing when they saw the decoration of this tomb. This tomb is very special because it was, it's known as the tomb of Antef-Iker, but actually it's a tomb that the Vizier Antef-Iker made for a lady whose name is Senet, his wife or his mother, we still don't know. And this Senet was sitting with a majesty figure, with a majesty statue sitting at the end of the tomb. And probably because of this royal iconography and this sitting statue, they imagine that they were in front of the tomb or a monument of this queen who became king in the late 12th dynasty. So they made a complete mistake, which shows that they could not understand what they have seen. And there are examples of that kind of scenes, of inscriptions made by hieratic scribes who could not read the hieroglyph they had just in front of their eyes. Another element that needs to be taken into account is that when you look at hieroglyphic panels, they always well balanced and designed. They show competencies of graphic designing. Graphic designers that you cannot find when you have a painter who venture out of his comfort zone, who try to write hieroglyphic panels, although he was not trained to do so. This explains also why they had to edit text, because it always has to start with the first square on the first corner and to end with the last square on the last corner. And if you don't use those competencies of graphic designers, it will never work like this. You will always fail to fill the entire panel. So this shows that it's what was at stake, what was needed was visual competencies of graphic designers. I mean, competencies of painters, of specialists of visual production. So the question could be rephrased, not so much who could read the hieroglyphs, but who needed to be able to read hieroglyphs, and who else than the artists, as I try to show with these lectures. So it's time now for conclusions. So if we keep with this division between tachygraphies or hieratic and hieroglyphic writings, it's clear that the zone of hieratic was the zone of normal scribes, those who wrote in daily life for accounting, for all that kinds of needs for writing in daily life. Most probably, only a small part of them had an access to hieroglyphic writing. Hence my overlapping here. The hieroglyphic writing seems to have been the specialty of artists, the ones who needed to be master in hieroglyphic writing. And of course, top artists, those the chief in artistic traits, were of course trained in hieratic also. And it seems that most of the workforces in artistic productions only had very limited access to hieroglyphic script. I would call it a superficial approach of ancient Egyptian writing system, although they were living in a space saturated with hieroglyphs, so they could use them. But there was a clear educational hierarchy within the artistic workforces of ancient Egypt. And the majority of artistic workforces of ancient Egypt probably had only a limited access to hieroglyphic writing. So we have to deal with this scheme with three different kinds of traits of professionals around writing traditions in ancient Egypt. This hieroglyphic culture of ancient Egypt engendered obviously a parallel non-scriptural system of communication, or at least of encoding information, but nevertheless influenced by the visuality of hieroglyphic script, especially in the context of the permeability and symbiosis between images and script proper. Artists derived their own system from the visual landscape they lived in, a visual landscape saturated with hieroglyphs, of which they made use as ready-made signs of communication to note some group markings or some individual information, to encode some or note down some accounting information, minimal accounting information that they had to do for themselves, or some information for communication in absentia in their own work, to mark an axis, for example, to provide the colleagues with assemblages marks, or to note and code the iconographic program to be depicted on the wall. And in some cases, some of them ventured out of their comfort zone to try to write some hieroglyphic panels, but most of them obviously they failed. And to conclude, or my last slide would be on this Sphinx, because I would like to remind you that we know nowadays that this is how our own alphabet came to life. This is this practice among the practitioners of the ancient Egyptian workforces that were acquainted, who had some sort of acquaintance, of superficial acquaintance with hieroglyphic writing, that was at the root of what Semitic workers who worked for the Egyptian crown in the Sinai developed in the Proto-Sinaitic writing that is at the roots of our alphabetic tradition. And what they did, the practice that developed those Semitic workers for the Egyptian crown in the Sinai, was actually probably the common practice among trades involving the artistic production in the Nile Valley. Thank you very much for your attention.
Fantastic talk, Dimitri. Thank you so much. It's just amazing to be reminded too that this isn't a binary issue of literate versus illiterate, but there are all the degrees in between, depending on what your job was and what the qualifications were. It's wonderful. We have some time for some questions, and I see in the Q&A that some are lined up already. So we'll do a few of these. Robert asks, is there any evidence of schools on how to become a scribe? Basically, where did the scribes learn their skills? Was it passed down within families?
So we have some evidence, but they are very specific, because the only evidence we have, as far as I know, are coming from, archaeological evidence are coming from the Al Medina, where some members of the community were trained as scribes. So we know from the object that they left, the pedagogic material evidence they left, how they were taught, which was what is called in pedagogy a global approach. So they copied the text and then learn hieratic that way. But those people, they were artists. They were members of the artistic community of the Al Medina. Otherwise, we don't have so much evidence to reconstruct this process.
Mm-hmm. Right. And Sully asks, what colors did the artists use, and what material was used to make the color? Would they have mixed materials to make a color?
So usually it's inorganic colors, with the exception of blue and green, which was made with glass, with frit that was broken. But it's quite well known, the materials that they used, and the possibilities are not so numerous. So the palette is quite limited. But it's inorganic materials like ochre, like soot for the black, and so this is the secret of the lens. This is why they lasted so well on the monuments until nowadays. I don't know if this answers the question sufficiently.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Shana asks, is there a difference in literacy competency between painters, those who painted the hieroglyphs, and sculptors, those who carved the hieroglyphs?
That's a very good question, and actually we don't know. It's quite easy to demonstrate with paintings because it involves less people. That in many places it's the same painter who made the figures and the text going with it, because it's the same painting layers and paint pots and that kind of things. For sculptures, it's much more difficult to be sure. We have a few hints to the fact that top artists, including in sculpture, were also literate, but it doesn't mean that all of them could. So, for example, I have in mind a statue in Berlin of a certain Nemti-Hotep. It's perfectly, exquisitely sculpted, but the inscriptions on the side of the throne are just scratched, and it was made by another hand, which suggests that maybe the hand who made the sculpture was not capable of doing a good hieroglyphic inscription to the statue.
And here comes an Egyptological question. So Vicky Almanza Villatoro has one for you. Thank you so much for this fascinating lecture. I have many questions, but I'm going to focus on these. She says, you mentioned a hierarchy of artists. How can we determine whose idea was, for example, the new hieroglyphs in the tomb of Nakht? Could Nakht himself have a say in this?
Very good question. So this Nakht is a low-ranking person in the hierarchy of the administration of Karnak. We know close to nothing about those gardeners of Amun. We have 2 mentions of them. That's it. So these people were not meant to pop up in the monumental landscape. This is really a UFO, this tomb. It's an exception that we have it. And it's very telling, I think, that it's one of the most exquisitely decorated tomb of the period. So I would assume that this Nakht would not need to be a literate person. But I cannot prove this. What I can prove is that the painter who was in charge of the decoration of this tomb was a top artist, because he could invent out of the normal thesaurus of scenes. And it seems that it's him who invented those new hieroglyphs. But of course, I'm sure that there was a control by the tomb owner. So in the tomb of Senefer, for example, we can really see the interaction between the painters and the tomb owner, because he came many times and asked for modification in the decoration of his tomb. There's also a very good case in the study of TT65 by Thomas Baksh, who was able to show what was the part of the tomb owner and what was the part of the painter, because he knows the painter and he knows the tomb owner, and they brought in for the monuments their own visual culture. One coming from the temple, the other one coming from the Valley of the King. So in some cases, it's possible to show what was the part of each. But I'm sure that, of course, like in any artistic production, the tomb owner was the key figure. So he was the one to say yes or no for any invention in his monument.
Reminds me of the Senmut statues, where he invents those hieroglyphic signs by himself and mentions that he's the one who made them up. I think we have time for just one more. Were only men scribes, or could women write too? Giselle asked you that question.
Also a very good question. We have no clear evidence of women writing in ancient Egypt. The only thing, so we have 2 things. We have the title for scribe in feminine, but it has been argued quite convincingly by some colleagues that it probably refers to people in charge of the making up. Who paint on the face and not so much write hieroglyphs. And the only other evidence is that in some Theban tombs, you have under the chair of some female tomb owners, or the ladies who were married to the tomb owner. In some cases, you can have a painting or writing palette, but maybe it was a motif to fill the gap there, and it's not a clear and undisputable evidence that they could write, but it suggests, at least it's a hint, Otherwise, we don't have clear evidence that women had access to writing abilities.
Right. Well, those are some tough questions we threw at you, but I think you answered them all brilliantly. And it was also a brilliant lecture. So thank you so much, Dimitri. And also we should say thank you for staying up till midnight, where it's now past 1 o'clock in the morning where you are. So we're extra grateful for you fitting into our time schedule. We thank all of you for joining us as well. Don't forget March 31st, Antonio Morales will be speaking for us again, and we hope to see everyone there as well. Thanks again, Dimitri. Go and get some sleep.
My
Good night,
pleasure.
everyone.